Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Michael Cooper of Southwestern University in Georgetown, Texas. The year 2022 marks the 50th anniversary of the passing of the extraordinary composer, pianist, and racial justice champion Margaret Bonds. This past weekend, the African American Art Song Alliance, at its own 25th anniversary conference hosted by the University of California at Irvine, had a special session devoted to commemorating Margaret Bonds' passing and celebrating her extraordinary life and work. Those events included an amazing concert, and I also gave a little talk. A talk that tries to situate Margaret Bonds' earliest surviving songs, which have long been described as lost, in her professional development as a composer. Technological challenges prevented that session, that recording of the talk of mine, from turning out as I would like to have, so I have decided to re-record it, and that's what you're about to watch. This is a presentation that I call A Ghost No More on a prize-winning song by Margaret Bonds, No Longer Lost. I hope you'll enjoy it. I'd like to begin this short talk with some expressions of gratitude. First, this presentation would not have had a home if not for the hard work and the vision of Dr. Darrell Taylor in organizing the 25th anniversary conference of the African American Art Song Alliance. Dr. Taylor, thank you for all you've done to will this event and this profoundly beautiful alliance into existence. Further thanks are due to the heirs of composer Margaret Bonds for their kind permission to publish The Sea Ghost, and to Hildegard Publishing Company for allowing me to use and display pre-publication versions of their edition in this talk. Third, although this concert titled A Salute to Margaret Bonds includes the first ever documented live performance of The Sea Ghost, I needed to be able to use one during the talk itself, so soprano Zoe McCray and pianist Elizabeth Hill, both of Washington, D.C., graciously supplied a video recorded performance of that song, as well as the first ever documented performance of Margaret Bonds' earliest surviving song. And finally, a special debt of gratitude is due to Dr. Candace Johnson, whose brilliant, absolutely brilliant one-woman Margaret Bonds show was featured earlier in this conference. Toward the end of this talk, you'll hear Dr. Johnson channeling the voice of Margaret Bonds in readings taken from Bonds' sole surviving interview and little-known correspondence. Without those several kindnesses, this presentation would have been just so many words and sounds rattling around in my head, and I'm deeply indebted to all who helped to make it a reality. So with that said, let's get started. Until recently, precious little has been known about Margaret Bonds' development as a composer. We all know that in 1932, at the age of 19, she commenced the long string of extraordinary songs by which she is still best known. But because Bonds' early music has traditionally been considered lost, we have not known the story of her development as a composer. Did it occur gradually, or was it a sudden breakthrough? By all appearances, the latter would seem to be the case, but appearances, as we all know, can be deceiving. That's a problem because, as everyone here knows, we're talking about a composer of truly extraordinary intellect and creative imagination, a pianist who by age 18 had mastered repertoire that still today is daunting for pianists 3 times that age, and one of the greatest and most enduringly intrepid champions of racial justice that classical music has ever seen. She was also a composer whose works would have been easily, almost automatically published and widely performed and recorded had she been white or male, but whose more than 400 compositions have been marginalized because of her race and her sex. So yes, the stakes are high, far too high for us to settle for mere speculation where it comes to her development as a composer. We no longer have to. Recent research has brought to light no fewer than 4 early songs that not only add to the body of song that we have by Margaret Bonds, but also shed new light on her development as a composer. The earliest of those songs is the 1928 political campaign song, We're All for Hoover Today, and the second is The Sea Ghost, which won the 1932 Wanamaker Prize and has often been described as lost. Those 2 songs provide the essential, though previously unseen, context for the mature compositional voice of Margaret Bonds, which includes 4 more songs that were written between 1932 and 1934, 2 of those songs previously unknown. We'll return to that slightly later cluster of song later in this talk. For now, let's begin with the personal and professional context of which that body of song was born. Margaret Bonds was born in Chicago in 1913 to a mother, Estella Bonds, who was a pianist, organist, teacher, eventual founding member of the National Association of Negro Musicians, and longtime organist at Chicago's historic Berean Baptist Church, and a father, Monroe Alpheus Majors, who was a doctor so deeply involved in racial justice activities that he repeatedly had to move from one state to another in order to avoid the wrath of white hate groups. Dr. Majors also authored the book, Noted Negro Women, which was published in 1893. Margaret Bonds' parents divorced when she was 4 years old, and she was raised by her mother, also retaining her mother's surname and always revering her as one of the most important sources of inspiration in her life and work. Although she would later recollect that she had studied with Florence Price and William Levy Dawson, quote, as a child, end quote, she consistently singled out Abby Mitchell and Will Marion Cook as the most important of her early teachers, later recalling that Mitchell taught her, quote, the importance of the marriage between words and music which is demanded if one is to have a song of any consequence, end quote, and that Cook, quote, invested her with the responsibility of sending Negro music around the world, end quote. She was quickly recognized as a prodigy, and in 1928 a group of her school teachers hatched a plan to establish a fund that would enable her to further her musical studies. With the aid of scholarships from Alpha Kappa Alpha Incorporated and the Rosenwald Foundation, she attended Northwestern University beginning in 1929, there studying piano with Emily Butker-Bogue and, beginning in 1931, vocal composition with Carl Beecher and instrumental composition with Arne Oldberg. She received her bachelor's degree in 1933 and her master's degree in 1934, both of these in piano. Shown here is the cover and the page that identifies Bonds from the commencement program of her master's degree ceremonies. In the meantime, she had performed her friend and mentor Florence Price's first Fantasie Negre at the national meeting of the National Association of Negro Musicians in 1930, won first prize in the song category of the Rodman Wanamaker competition for The Sea Ghost in 1932, become the first African-American woman to feature as pianist with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra in 1933, and performed Price's concerto in one movement with the Women's Symphony Orchestra of Chicago at that same Century of Progress World's Fair in Chicago in 1934. At that point, she was all of 21 years old, and at that point, the compositional voice that we know as being Margaret Bonds had been manifest for 2 full years. So those few highlights from Margaret Bonds' early career say much about her talent, her energy, and her early abilities as performer of others' works, but they still leave unanswered the question of her development as a composer. To get an idea of that development, we need to look at her earliest surviving composition, a political campaign song for Herbert Hoover, who won the 1928 presidential election, titled We're All for Hoover Today. This song was written and published when Margaret Bonds was all of 15 years old. Its text is by her father, Dr. Majors, and this song is the only known collaboration between him and her. Probably everyone here wishes that Margaret Bonds' first musical act of political engagement had been on behalf of someone other than Herbert Hoover. The engraver of the published score probably got it right with the verbal eye roll that's in the footer to that published score. We're all for, etc. While it is initially puzzling that Bonds and her father endorsed such an obvious racist, that unlikely endorsement probably was obtained because in the late 1920s the tide of white on black violence in the United States showed no signs of abating, and Hoover, strategizing to win the support of enfranchised Northern blacks and sympathetic non-blacks, cunningly included an anti-lynching plank in his campaign platform, a plank he blithely ignored once he won the election. In any case, We're All for Hoover Today shows us that already at age 15, Margaret Bonds was a talented composer, a gifted melodist who also had a taste for active piano parts and harmonic adventure. That last trait is evident already in the conspicuously off-tonic beginning of the first period and the subsequent harmonic structure of that first period, as well as numerous passages later on that employ surprisingly sophisticated harmonic progressions, especially for a political campaign song that was written by a 15-year-old. Let's listen now to just the first strophe of We're All for Hoover Today, performed by soprano Zoe McCray and pianist Elizabeth Hill. We're All for Hoover Today is still a long way from the compositional voice that we know from the mid-1930s, and it clearly reflects the popular style of Bonds' teacher, Will Marion Cook. It's probably better than most of us could have written when we were 15 years old, and it demonstrates the remarkable store of talent and intellect that led Bonds' teachers to dub her a prodigy and enabled her to enroll at Northwestern University in 1929. Although, as we shall see, Bonds' experience at Northwestern was far from uniformly positive. While there, she would study vocal composition with the dean of the Northwestern University School of Music, composer and pianist Carl Milton Beecher, and that study was important for her in several ways. Here's a page from the 1931-1932 Northwestern University Bulletin that shows the entries for the two courses that she took with Dean Beecher. Bonds composed The Sea Ghost for those studies in vocal composition in either the spring or the fall of 1931, and in 1932 she submitted it to the Rodman Wanamaker Composition Competition. The awards for that competition were announced in a special ceremony held on September 25th, and for The Sea Ghost, Margaret Bonds won $250, which would be about $5,400 today, a considerable sum. Her triumph was announced in the university newspaper, the Daily Northwestern, on September 29th, although that article is at least as much about Beecher as it is about Bonds. The article identifies Bonds as a, quote, Negro girl, end quote, and states that she had been awarded the first prize in, quote, a contest restricted to Negro composers, end quote, noting that the praise she garnered for the song had encouraged her to submit it to the competition and adding that, quote, Miss Bond's specialty is piano, but she has developed a decided gift for composition, according to Dean Beecher, end quote. The text of The Sea Ghost was first published by Frank Dempster Sherman in The Century, an illustrated monthly magazine, in 1892, and was widely reprinted and anthologized. Sherman titled it A Sea Ghost, not The Sea Ghost. Although Sherman is today regarded as a minor lyricist and author of children's verses, he was well regarded in the early 20th century. His poem, Springtime of Love, was set by Horatio Parker in 1905. His poem, Until, was set by Samuel Coleridge Taylor and published in 1908 in that setting. And another poem, God's Miracle of May, was set by Arne Oldberg, who was another of Bonds' teachers at Northwestern, in 1906. Its text reads, all night I heard along the coast the sea her grief outpour, and with the dawn arose a ghost to haunt the furrowed shore. And when from out the grey mist rolled the sun above the town, a shipwrecked sailor came and told of how the ship went down. Then did I sudden understand the sobbing of the sea, and of that white ghost on the sand I knew the mystery. On its surface, this poem is a ghost story with all the sophistication of campfire stories, or for that matter, some of the movies my grandsons watch, or that I watch. But The Century was a magazine for adults, not children, and this is, after all, a poem, not children's verses. There's more to it than its surface. In the first stanza, the unidentified, solitary lyric persona looks out over a furrowed shore haunted by a sea outpouring its grief. In the second, the coming light of day brings the ghost of a sailor whose tragic shipwrecked death that sorrowful sea bemoans. And in the third strophe, the light of day is mirrored by the light of understanding as the protagonist recognizes the tragedy that befell the ghost with whom, it turns out, she stands on that same shore furrowed by sorrow. The ghost shares the space and the experiences of the protagonist, and the protagonist's recognition of that shared tragedy is the telos of the poem. Given this, the sea ghost emerges as a tale of repressed memory, of a life taken, and the belated realization and recollection in the mysterious light of understanding of a story left untold. The sorrowful sea is a metaphor for the protagonist's own troubled consciousness, the gray mists and breaking sunlight for memories, repression, and retrieval, and the ghost for the protagonist's traumatized former self. The poem is thus a parable for the tragedies that will remain ever unresolved if their memory is repressed. And the sea ghost, it turns out, is not a simple ghost story at all. 18-year-old Margaret Bonds ably translated this parable of haunted, sorrowing grief into music, and in so doing, revealed her familiarity with another well-known musical tale of haunted, sorrowing grief, the celebrated song Der Leiermann from Franz Schubert's Winterreise. Both songs are in slow tempo, both begin pianissimo, both use a highly repetitive piano accompaniment composed of just a few melodic and motivic cells, and both feature an accented, sustained chord introduced by an appoggiatura on the raised fourth. There's also plenty of text painting in Bonds' song. For example, the appearance of the ghost is reflected by eerie chromatic harmonies in the accompaniment. The piano part features a turbulent, rumbling surge that might represent the cresting of the sea's waves or perhaps the gusts of sea winds. The coming of the light of dawn is mirrored by a turn from the initial A minor to F major, and as the ghost tells of the shipwreck that took its life, the vocal line descends and the piano part includes a chromatic descent, both gestures that portray the ship's descent into its watery grave. That said, there's a world of difference between the barren stasis of Der Leiermann and the surging waves of unvoiced sorrow in The Sea Ghost. Der Leiermann is a tale of tragedy unchanged, while The Sea Ghost is a tale of tragedy revealed and recognized. That, too, did not escape the musical attention of 18-year-old Margaret Bonds. Bonds tonally acknowledges the poem's division into three strophes. The first strophe begins and ends in A minor. The second strophe begins in a somewhat brighter F major as the day begins to break, and understanding also, but modulates back through D minor to A minor as the ghost tells its tragic tale, and the moment of recognition in the third strophe is symbolically represented in the reprise of the opening material in the original key in Bonds' setting. Throughout, the surges in the piano with the dissonant lowered ninth at their summit are sonorous metaphors for the persistent sorrow that rises and breaks in the present of the lyric persona. Tonight's program will include the first ever documented live performance of The Sea Ghost, given by soprano Nicole Jenkins and pianist Lorna Griffith, a historic live reveal of a song long considered lost. For now, in order to illustrate the points just made, let's listen to a video recorded performance made specifically for this presentation by soprano Zoe McCray and pianist Elizabeth Hill. It's really quite an accomplished song for a composer who was but 18 years old, especially in comparison to We're All for Hoover Today. Indeed, the Sea Ghost brings the penetrating originality that would become the signature of Margaret Bonds' mature musical voice a little bit closer to the surface. But that voice is still not quite there. And so we have to wonder who or what the unseen force was that finally enabled it to emerge from the depths. For just look at what happens in her next compositions. The Sea Ghost was immediately followed by an early version of her setting of Langston Hughes's Winter Moon, then by the setting of Joyce Kilmer's Sleep Song for women's voices and piano and the solo version of that song. These were followed by the setting of Hughes's Poème d'automne, early versions of some of the songs on poems by Edna St. Vincent Millay and Robert Frost, and the early, now lost version of To a Brown Girl Dead, the extraordinary and still unpublished, but also ravishingly beautiful setting of Paul Laurence Dunbar's Sunset, and of course her iconic setting of The Negro Speaks of Rivers, that last written in 1936 when Bonds was just 23. Now, to sample that development of song, of genius in song, would greatly exceed the limits of this paper, but to give you a sense of the qualitative growth that manifests this explosion of artistic creativity, let me ask you to compare the Sea Ghost, which you just heard, with this short excerpt from one of my favorite fruits of that flowering of mature song, the Poème d'automne, which was premiered on April 15th, 1934. This performance, by the way, is the one on Dr. Louise Toppin's wonderful album, Ah, Love But a Day.
The autumn leaves are too heavy with color. The slender trees on the Vulcan road are dressed in scarlet and gold like young courtesans.
It's a different world, a completely different compositional voice. And so you see the problem. The ghost that is the subject of the Sea Ghost is only one of several phantoms in play here. Of the other ones, arguably the most important is the one whose agency completed Margaret Bonds' musical maturation, the one that enabled her to grow 10 or more years as a composer in the mere months that separated the Sea Ghost from the mature songs just sampled. And that takes us back to the question, the problem that we posed at the outset. What happened to effect such an enormous transformation in such a short time? With that question, I'm done sharing anything new from me in this short talk, because everyone here knows what happened, what the unseen but powerfully felt presence was that took Margaret Bonds from the Sea Ghost to Poème d'automne. It was Bonds's first encounter with the poetry of Langston Hughes. The beauty, courage, power, and wisdom of Hughes's voice, the artistic and social kinship of spirit that Bonds shared with him, and the career-long friendship and collaboration that the two artists enjoyed collectively transformed her as an artist. Although she might easily have viewed her many accomplished during those years surrounding the Sea Ghost as the keys to her compositional maturation, her autobiographical notes later in life draw little attention to those things. Instead, she consistently singles out Hughes as the transformative force in her creative life. So let's use the last few minutes of this talk to listen to something old, to Margaret Bonds explaining in her own words how the phenomenon of Langston Hughes' poetry saved her. Let's start with a familiar statement. This one is taken from an interview that Bonds gave to the noted historian of Black theater, James Hatch, on December 28, 1971. It and the following excerpts are read for us by Dr. Candace Kerr Johnson.
I met Langston, his work. I was at the Evanston Public Library, If I had any misgivings, which I would have to have, here you are in a setup where restaurants, they don't serve you. You're going to college, you're sacrificing, trying to get through school. And I know that poem helped save me, So then about a year later, I said it for Marian Anderson, and she never sang it. She never sang it. Yep. She knew I did it for her, and she said that, now this is the crazy thing. She said that it was too difficult.
Bonds spoke in more detail and with greater candor about her first encounter with Hughes's poetry in a letter that she wrote to her daughter, Diane Richardson, around 1969. Here, she further explains how her initial encounter with The Negro Speaks of Rivers instilled in her a sense of pride in her African and African American heritage. Then, referring to the racist depredations she had received at the supposedly integrated Northwestern University, she states that she set Hughes's poem to music in order to instill in Black folk feelings of pride, of superiority rather than inferiority.
As a young woman, younger than you are now, I read this poem in the basement of the Evanston Public Library. I found my identity through Uncle Langston's great poem and set the poem to music in order to inspire Black people. We didn't designate them as Black in those days, but I wanted to inspire them with courage, pride, feelings of superiority rather than inferiority.
The third and final quote is the one that most explicitly connects the salvation that Hughes's poetry brought to Margaret Bonds with the racist environment to which she was subjected at Northwestern. Flatly refuting the Daily Northwestern's self-serving portrayal of the white benevolence of Bonds' education, the composer here describes Evanston as a city controlled by white Southerners and derides the university as a, quote, cesspool of white supremacy, bigotry, and prejudice, end quote. Finally, she explains the nature of her salvation, stating outright that Hughes, quote, wrote a truth that cannot be denied, end quote, when he countermanded refusals in restaurants and suspicious glances from shopkeepers by reminding Black people that Black is beautiful.
The Africans who are a part of my ancestry say, if a man doesn't know from whence he came, he can't possibly know where he's going. My mother's mother, Margaret Ann Bonds, from babyhood taught me to be proud of my African ancestry. Every time an African came to lecture in Chicago where I was born, Margaret Ann bundled me up and took me. She brainwashed me with the idea that Africans are superior people, that African dyes never fade, that African men can row boats in the face of forceful waves, that Africans could weave cloth that outlasts the cloth of any other people in the world, that Africans' rhythmic sense is far superior to any other peoples of the world, that Africans could swim turbulent rivers and survive because of their virility. Having convinced me of my superiority because of my having African blood, at age 16, Margaret Ann forced me to arise at 5 in the morning to travel 17 miles from Chicago to Evanston to attend that cesspool of white supremacy, bigotry, prejudice known as Northwestern University. Colored girls weren't even allowed to swim in the swimming pool. Their black might rub off. However, she boasted to friends, Margaret is going to menu. But after refusals in restaurants, suspicious glances from shopkeepers, and various effronteries and other insults to the, quote, American way of life, I discovered Langston Hughes in the basement of the Evanston Public Library. My landlady, a cateress, explained that Evanston was controlled by thousands of Southerners. Mrs. Cromer, her name was, catered a luncheon periodically for a club to which 5,000 Southern women comprised the membership. The Negro Speaks of Rivers was my introduction to Langston Hughes. His great poem corroborated everything Mima had told me about my people. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. During my sophomore year at a major American university, I discovered a poet who wrote a truth that cannot be denied. Now in my mature years, I know why little Black people all over our land revere Langston Hughes. Before Martin Luther King Jr. and later Black militancy, Langston Hughes constantly reminds us that we are an important entity in the world population, that we need have no feelings of inferiority, that we are black and beautiful.
And so we see it. The final, unseen, but oh so powerfully felt presence that produced Margaret Bonds' compositional breakthrough was not a genteel education at a benevolent white university. Far from it. On the contrary, that breakthrough was the result of Black self-affirmation. It was born in the crucible of bigotry, prejudice, hardship, and sorrow that Bonds endured at Northwestern as an African American woman, but it was not born of that crucible. It was born of something altogether different. For in that segregated library basement during her sophomore year, a voice rose from the pages of the crisis to meet Margaret Bonds, just as the sea ghost rose from the mist to bring the dawn of understanding to that song's protagonist. And by Bonds's own account, that voice, that phantom presence that only she saw, but whose effects we all hear so clearly today, saved her. It transported her, and it transformed her from a talented but still academic composer into the extraordinary phenomenon we celebrate today. It was the poetic voice of Langston Hughes. With that, my friends, I thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this.